It is 5 in the morning, and Eva Moses Kor has been standing for half an hour on the Appellplatz at Birkenau, lined up beside her twin sister, when she feels her body begin to betray her. Her stomach twists, cold sweat runs down her back despite the freezing air, and she knows exactly what is coming: another bout of dysentery, the same disease that has already killed half the women in her barrack. She cannot move. Breaking formation during roll call means the whip, sometimes a bullet. So she remains still, her legs pressed tightly together, calculating how long she can hold out before her body decides for her, in front of the guards, in front of everyone else, with nowhere to hide. That calculation, repeated every morning by tens of thousands of women throughout the Nazi concentration camp system, was not an incidental detail of camp life. For many of them, it meant the difference between surviving one more day and being marked as useless for work, and therefore expendable. Around her, other women were making exactly the same calculation in silence, eyes fixed straight ahead, allowing no gesture to betray the private struggle they were waging against their own bodies. The air smelled of frozen mud, distant smoke, and the peculiar mixture of stale sweat and disease that saturated every barrack in the camp. No one spoke. Talking during roll call meant attracting the attention of a guard. And the attention of a guard, at that precise moment, was the one thing none of them could afford. The deliberate absence of toilets, clean water, and toilet paper was not a logistical oversight by the Nazi regime. It was an administrative decision sustained over years, enforced with the same bureaucratic coldness that governed the rest of the system, and its medical consequences became yet another instrument of selection and death. Where there should have been sanitation, there were wooden holes shared by hundreds of people. Where there should have been drinking water, there were vats of stagnant liquid, used both for washing faces and for transmitting typhus. Where there should have been privacy, there were 2 minutes, timed, watched, and denied. The mechanism that would later be repeated in every camp of the Nazi concentration camp system had a direct precedent in the city of Warsaw, a year before most of those camps reached their final form. In the autumn of 1940, the German occupation authorities sealed more than 400,000 Jewish people inside an area of just over 3 square kilometers. Surrounded by a wall 3 meters high and 16 kilometers long, an area the German administration itself referred to in internal documents as an epidemic danger zone. The official justification invoked the risk of typhus infection, and German doctors who supported the decision repeated the ideological premise that the Jewish population was a natural carrier of the disease. The administrative reality was the exact opposite. It was precisely the overcrowding imposed by the wall itself, the interruption of the drinking water supply, and the drastic reduction of food rations to less than 200 calories per day that produced. Months after the wall had been built, the typhus epidemic the German authorities had already used in advance as a pretext to justify its construction. The Nazi regime did not merely exploit a pre-existing disease. It engineered the exact material conditions that guaranteed its emergence, then presented the result of its own design as proof of the threat it claimed to be fighting. That same pattern, repeated first in Warsaw and later in every concentration camp in the system, is the key to understanding why the deprivation of water, soap, and sanitation was never a logistical failure, but part of the method itself. The deprivation of hygiene did not begin at the camp gate. It began days earlier, inside the cattle cars in which the Reich Railway Administration transported deportees eastward. A single car, originally designed for 40 men or 8 horses, might be packed with as many as 100 or 120 people, forced to remain standing during journeys that in the most extreme cases lasted several days without stopping. The only container available for the bodily needs of everyone inside was, when there was one at all, a simple metal bucket placed in a corner, with no partition or curtain offering even the smallest degree of privacy, from dozens of strangers pressed together only centimeters away. When the bucket filled, which happened quickly, its contents spilled across the floor of the wagon with every braking motion or curve in the tracks, mixing with the little luggage the deportees had managed to keep. Summer heat or the cutting cold of winter, depending on the transport, accelerated the decomposition of those who died during the journey from exhaustion or disease, and their bodies remained among the living until the next stop, because no railway regulation provided for their removal before the train reached its destination. Those who finally stepped down onto the ramp at Auschwitz or another destination camp already carried, before crossing any gate, the first signs of the same physical degradation the camp would then sustain for months. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, The central latrine in the women's camp consisted of a brick building with 2 long rows of holes cut into a concrete platform, with no partitions, no doors, nothing to prevent 100 women from defecating at the same time in full view of one another. Access was restricted to certain times of day, usually during the brief interval between morning roll call and departure for the labor details. Anyone who needed to go outside that window had to ask a capo for permission. Permission rarely came in time. The prisoners learned to regulate their own bodies with a discipline no survival manual could teach. Hold it, wait, calculate, and when the calculation failed, endure the humiliation and the punishment that often followed. Before that brick building even existed, during the camp's first year of operation, each barrack had only 1 bucket for the nighttime needs of several hundred women, a container that filled within hours and was then left where it stood until the following morning. The work detail responsible for emptying and cleaning those latrines had a name the prisoners themselves used without irony: the Scheißkommando. Digging, bailing out waste, carrying excrement in barrels to the fields where it was used as fertilizer. Any ordinary prisoner would have tried to avoid such work at all costs. And yet, according to several survivors, including Kor herself, being assigned to the Scheißkommando came to be regarded, within the inverted logic of the camp, as a stroke of luck. The latrines were among the few places where SS guards did not willingly enter, repelled by the same stench that tormented the prisoners. That absence of surveillance, that small pocket free from German eyes, became the closest thing to privacy that existed in the camp. Women who in any other work detail would have been beaten for stopping even a second too long could, here, whisper a sentence, exchange a piece of news, cry without anyone seeing them. At night, the problem did not disappear. It changed form. Barracks held 6 to 8 prisoners on each tier of bunks, packed together on wooden boards without mattresses, and the route to the outdoor latrine crossed a guarded yard where going outside after curfew could result in being shot without warning. The consequence was predictable, and camp authorities knew it perfectly well. Hundreds of prisoners urinated where they slept. The regime responded not by making nighttime access easier, but by punishing the symptom. Women found with wet bedding were classified under an administrative label, Bettnässerin, bedwetter. That label meant reduced rations, harsher labor assignments, and, for repeat cases, direct inclusion on selection lists. The body betrayed the prisoner before any guard even had to question her, and the camp turned an inevitable biological consequence of its own design into yet another reason to condemn the person suffering from it. Water offered no relief. In most camps, the prisoners' supply came through a limited number of taps or collective vats of non-potable water shared by thousands of people, replenished at a frequency determined entirely by the administrative whim of the commandant. At Bergen-Belsen, as the camp population multiplied with the mass arrival of death marches from the east beginning in late 1944, the clean water system collapsed completely. Prisoners drank from wells contaminated by the accumulation of human waste around them. That water, the same water used for drinking, cooking the meager soup, and washing, became the principal vehicle for the spread of dysentery and typhoid fever that devastated the camp during its final months. Toilet paper simply did not exist as an issued resource. No camp regulation provided for its distribution. Women who had been imprisoned for months developed improvised solutions: a strip torn from the inside hem of the striped dress, a dry leaf picked up on the way to a labor detail, or, in the rare cases where someone worked in an administrative office, a scrap of waste paper stolen and hidden beneath clothing with the same care others used to conceal a crust of bread. Underwear was not replaced. The same garment, when a prisoner had one at all, might be worn for weeks or months without washing, and skin deterioration around the genitals and rectum became so widespread that prisoner doctors, forced to treat patients in the primitive camp infirmaries, later described it as one of the most constant afflictions among the inmate population, almost as universal as hunger itself. Veteran prisoners taught new arrivals, in the little time they shared before the first roll call, which corners of the camp might contain dry grass or discarded paper. That knowledge passed in whispers from one generation of inmates to the next, like any other essential survival technique. Scabies spread along a parallel path. The mite that causes it is transmitted by direct contact and thrives in overcrowded, filthy conditions, exactly what the barracks provided. Without soap, hot water, or spare clothing, an infected prisoner could transmit it to the 7 or 8 women sharing her bunk within days. The itching became so intense that many scratched their skin raw at night, opening wounds that then became infected because of the same lack of hygiene that had caused the problem in the first place. Camp authorities usually responded not with medical treatment, but with punitive quarantines that isolated entire blocks, sometimes cutting off even the limited access to latrines they already had, and thereby worsening the very disease they claimed to be controlling. The louse was the deadliest vector of all because it did more than cause discomfort. It transmitted epidemic typhus, a disease that under concentration camp conditions could kill a large proportion of those infected within 1 or 2 weeks. SS Medical Services understood the risk perfectly. Their response, however, was never sustained hygiene, but sporadic delousing campaigns, usually when a new transport arrived or when authorities feared the epidemic might spread to the German garrison. These procedures involved shaving the head and body, immersing prisoners in a disinfectant solution that burned skin already cracked by the cold, then returning them to clothing that was rarely disinfected with the same thoroughness as their bodies. The result was predictable. Within weeks, the lice returned, and with them came the next wave of fever. Primo Levi, deported to Auschwitz-Monowitz in 1944, described in his memoirs one detail that summarizes the true state of camp sanitation better than any statistic. A single vat of water in the barrack was used by dozens of men to wash their hands and faces before receiving soup. The water, turned gray by constant use, was changed only as often as whoever happened to be on duty that week decided. Washing under those conditions did not clean. It redistributed filth from one body to another. And yet Levi insisted that preserving the gesture, even when hygienically useless, helped preserve something the camp was trying to tear away completely. The sense of still being a human being rather than an animal reduced to its own dirt. Collective showers, when they existed outside the context of immediate extermination, were scheduled at intervals that rarely exceeded once a week. During periods of administrative collapse, entire blocks might go months without access to hot water. When the water came, it lasted seconds. Barely enough time to get wet before the next group of naked prisoners was already waiting in line. Soap was not issued regularly. When it appeared, it was often a tiny bar that had to be shared among dozens of people until it disappeared entirely before the next issue, if another issue ever came. Prisoners learned to recognize, from the color and texture of the shared bar, whether it contained even enough fat to produce foam, or whether it was little more than a block of caustic soda that irritated skin already cracked by cold without cleaning anything at all. This accumulation of filth, itching, chronic diarrhea, and fever functioned, within the administrative logic of the camp, as a clinical criterion for selection. SS doctors making periodic rounds through the infirmaries and barracks looked precisely for external signs of physical collapse: skin covered in scabies, bodies weakened by chronic dysentery. The dull gaze and dragging gait prisoners themselves had learned to recognize as the threshold of death, and referred to among themselves as the Muselmann. A prisoner who appeared at medical inspection with visible signs of intestinal or skin disease had a much greater chance of being separated for the gas chamber or a lethal phenol injection than someone who could conceal his condition. During the few seconds the inspection lasted, the camp deliberately made prisoners sick through sanitary neglect. Then it used the resulting illness as proof that they were no longer useful for labor. There was, however, one crack in this system of calculated scarcity. Prisoners assigned to the Canada work detail, responsible for sorting the suitcases and belongings brought by victims who believed they were being resettled, occasionally had access to objects unattainable elsewhere in the camp: bars of scented soap, bottles of cologne, toothbrushes, even spare underwear, all confiscated from people who in most cases had already been murdered in the gas chambers hours earlier. Taking any of these objects out of the guarded warehouse area meant the risk of immediate death if a guard discovered it. And yet the practice prisoners called organizing, hiding a small object in clothing and later passing it to a sick companion, continued clandestinely for years. A bar of soap stolen from someone else's suitcase and silently handed to a person who had been unable to wash an infected wound for weeks represented an act of generosity almost impossible to measure outside the camp. It meant risking one's own life to give someone else, if only for a single day, the ability to feel clean, to remember that before becoming a number tattooed on the forearm, that person had been, and still was, a human being with a body of their own that deserved care. Those who participated in this silent exchange network knew that one mistake, one surprise search when leaving the warehouse, could cost them their lives immediately, and still, year after year, They found ways to evade surveillance for the sake of someone they often barely knew. By the end of 1943, the Birkenau administration completed construction of a building internally known as the Central Sauna. The Central Sauna, located beside the warehouses of confiscated belongings, the prisoners called Canada because of the wealth stored inside. On paper, the Central Sauna represented an improvement. It was a single facility where newly selected arrivals received a shower, had their entire bodies shaved, and were tattooed and registered before being sent to the barracks. In daily practice, however, the experience inside the building functioned more as calculated humiliation than as a genuine sanitary measure. Prisoners who had already spent months or years in the camp knew that no infrastructure improvement meant regular access to water for them. The Central Sauna processed new arrivals once, at admission. Then it returned them to the same barracks without running water, the same insufficient latrines, and the same regime of scarcity governing the rest of the camp. The largest building ever constructed at Birkenau for hygiene did nothing to alter the chronic typhus epidemic or the lice infestation that defined daily life. It simply offered, once, the appearance of an institution concerned with the cleanliness of people it was in fact designed to destroy. The same compound that made mass murder possible in the gas chambers was used in other chambers within the complex for an apparently different purpose. Hydrogen cyanide, marketed under the name Zyklon B, had originally been developed as an industrial pesticide, and at Auschwitz it was routinely used in separate disinfection chambers to kill lice in prisoners' clothing, a use invoiced by the supplier, Tesch und Stabenow, to the camp administration as if it were an ordinary sanitary service. Clothes were placed inside these chambers, exposed to the gas long enough to kill the parasites, and then returned to prisoners without addressing the underlying problem. The lice came back within days because the conditions that produced them, overcrowding, lack of water, and the absence of regular clothing replacement, remained unchanged. The same poison used to murder hundreds of thousands of people in the gas chambers of Birkenau was applied, a short distance away, as a cosmetic remedy to a problem the structure of the camp itself reproduced every week. Within this generalized scarcity, access to water and soap was not distributed equally even among prisoners. Capos and internal functionaries, prisoners to whom the SS administration delegated surveillance and control over the rest of the inmate population, enjoyed privileged access to more frequent showers, better quality soap, and replacement clothing that rarely reached ordinary prisoners. That privilege was not accidental. It was part of the mechanism by which the camp kept its own population divided, offering small material improvements in exchange for active collaboration in controlling others. A clean, well-fed capo with regular access to water could be distinguished at a glance from an ordinary prisoner. That visible difference constantly reinforced the internal hierarchy the SS had created precisely so it would not have to police every corner of the camp itself. Those who collaborated with the control system washed. Those who did not carry the full weight of the filth the system itself produced. That same filth, systematically manufactured by the deliberate neglect of camp administration, was later turned into propaganda material by the regime that had created it. German photographers and cameramen documented ghettos and camps by showing emaciated people covered in dirt, their skin marked by scabies and lice. Those images were circulated within the regime's propaganda machinery as visual proof of the racial inferiority Nazi ideology attributed to its victims. The circular logic was as simple as it was perverse. A population was deprived of water, soap, latrines, and clean clothing until it had been reduced to the most degraded physical condition possible. Then that condition was photographed as though it were evidence of an innate state rather than the direct and calculated consequence of a policy of destruction through hunger and disease. The camp did not merely make its prisoners sick. It used the sickness it had manufactured to justify, before the German public, the treatment it had inflicted upon them. The same mechanism of manipulation reached its most elaborate form in Theresienstadt, the ghetto Nazi propaganda presented as a model Jewish settlement. An internal SS and German police report, dated 1943, described the real situation without ambiguity. Barracks housing around 100 people each, bunks stacked 3 levels high, extremely inadequate sanitary conditions, and a shortage of water that made an outbreak of typhus, in the report's own words, inevitable. A year later, with a visit by the International Red Cross scheduled for June 1944, the German administration did not improve those conditions. It concealed them. More than 7,500 prisoners were deported to Auschwitz in the days beforehand simply to reduce the impression of overcrowding visitors might perceive. Facades were painted, flower gardens were installed, a fake shop was set up. A football match was organized so Danish and international delegates could witness a completely fabricated scene of normality. The Red Cross delegate who toured the ghetto that day concluded in his official report that conditions were satisfactory. Months later, the overwhelming majority of the prisoners deported to Auschwitz to clear that scene had been murdered in the gas chambers of Birkenau. In the basement of Block 11 at Auschwitz were 4 punishment cells barely 1 square meter in size, known as Stehzellen, standing cells. Up to 4 prisoners at a time were forced inside each one through a small opening at floor level and made to spend the night completely upright, without enough room even to sit, with only a 5-centimeter air vent for ventilation. There was no container of any kind inside and no access to a latrine. Prisoners confined there for days or weeks had to relieve themselves where they stood, onto their own feet and those of their cellmates, in total darkness. Survivor Josef Kral, who testified years later about the 6 weeks he spent locked in one of those cells, remembered that when he was let out in the mornings to perform a full day of labor, the skin on his legs had become macerated from prolonged contact with his own waste. That damage was added to hunger and exhaustion as part of the same punishment. Other prisoners who passed through those cells later said the worst torment was not hunger or cold, but the impossibility of moving even a single centimeter away from one's own body after it had been turned into a source of filth for hours that stretched into days. The punishment cell required no additional instrument of torture. Absolute denial of any possibility of hygiene, sustained for long enough, was sufficient by itself to destroy a human body. At Mauthausen, the geography of the camp itself made the problem worse. Prisoners assigned to the granite quarry climbed and descended the 186 steps carved into the rock every day, carrying stone blocks on their shoulders, soaked in sweat that mixed with mineral dust and dried on the skin into a crust no prisoner had any way to remove before the next workday. The return to camp included no assigned time for washing. Dinner, when there was dinner, was eaten with the same hands that had carried stone all day, covered in dust and weeks of accumulated filth. Most barracks at Mauthausen had no running water. The few available wash basins were concentrated in a central building accessible only at restricted hours under direct guard supervision, and guards often used access to water itself as a form of extortion or arbitrary punishment. Veteran prisoners developed a silent code for recognizing who was beginning to fail. Skin turning waxy, a change in body odor, the rhythm of breathing during the climb up the stairs. Recognizing these signs in another prisoner almost always meant quietly distancing oneself from him, not out of cruelty but out of survival instinct. Remaining too close to someone the capos had already identified as a likely candidate for the next purge increased the chances of being swept up in the same roundup. For female prisoners, sanitary deprivation added another layer rarely mentioned in male accounts from the period. The combination of severe malnutrition, drastic weight loss, and extreme physical stress caused menstruation to stop within weeks for most women, a phenomenon so widespread that many survivors later remembered it almost as a relief within the horror, because it freed them from a problem they had no means to manage. There were no sanitary pads, cloths, or materials of any kind issued by the camp administration. Women who continued menstruating, usually recent arrivals whose bodies had not yet undergone the metabolic collapse affecting longer-term prisoners, had to improvise using strips torn from their underwear, when they had any, or rags taken from discarded clothing, washed without soap in the same murky water used for everything else. The absence of sanitary pads or any reliable substitute created not only constant humiliation before guards and other prisoners, but an additional medical risk. Vaginal infections caused by the lack of menstrual hygiene joined the already long list of illnesses no camp infirmary treated seriously and, in the worst cases, became yet another reason for selection during periodic medical inspections deciding who remained fit for work and who did not. Hungarian gynecologist Gisela Perl, deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in May 1944, was assigned by Josef Mengele himself to treat prisoners in the women's camp. When she realized that any pregnancy discovered during medical examinations meant immediate death for the woman and her child, Perl began performing clandestine abortions to prevent that outcome, under conditions almost impossible for any medical professional to imagine. She had no sterilized instruments, no anesthesia, no clean water, not even an enclosed space where she could work with a minimum of asepsis. She performed procedures on the dirt floors of barracks or on the bare wooden boards of bunks, using, in her own words recorded after the war, only her dirty hands as the sole instrument available. The complete absence of sanitary resources that defined camp life did not kill only through disease. It also forced those trying to save lives to do so under conditions that anywhere else would have been considered criminal negligence, but here represented the only form of medical resistance possible against a system that turned motherhood into a death sentence. Children who survived arrival selections and remained in the camps, whether with their mothers in family blocks in some camps or in separate children's blocks elsewhere, paid an even higher price for the same deprivation. Their skin, thinner and more sensitive than that of adults, developed sores and infections more quickly after prolonged contact with dirty clothing and parasite-infested bedding. Their immune systems, already weakened by the chronic hunger they suffered just like adults, could not withstand the same burden of dysentery or typhus. Child mortality in the camps was clearly higher than among the rest of the inmate population. The few testimonies left by people who were children at the time describe an early and brutal lesson. Understanding, before any adult explained it, that a dirty body, covered in bites or showing visible signs of diarrhea, drew guards' attention much more easily than one that managed to remain unnoticed. And that attention rarely brought anything good. At Buchenwald, the disinfection building near the camp entrance served a dual function that very few new arrivals understood immediately. In theory, according to regulations, it was used to eliminate lice and disinfect clothing from incoming transports. In daily practice, the steam in the chambers reached temperatures high enough to destroy striped uniforms before they could be returned to their owners, forcing prisoners to wait weeks, sometimes months, for replacement clothing, while covering themselves with paper sacks or scraps given to them by other inmates. The disinfection process, intended to combat one infestation, directly created the conditions for the next. Naked or poorly clothed bodies exposed to the harsh Thuringian winter, standing in the same lines where they had just been exposed to steam. A clandestine infirmary maintained inside Buchenwald by a group of German communist prisoners who had managed to infiltrate certain internal administrative positions, operated according to a basic principle its organizers repeated among themselves. Every case of dysentery or skin infection had to be hidden from official SS inspection for as long as possible. Because the official camp infirmary did not treat, it classified people for death, hiding a sick prisoner under a blanket during roll call, falsifying a record, delaying a diagnosis. Each of these acts, repeated thousands of times over the years the camp operated, saved lives the official medical system would have marked for elimination within days. Inside Buchenwald itself, the same typhus spread uncontrollably through the inmate population by the lack of hygiene also became an object of scientific research. Beginning in early 1942, the Waffen-SS Hygiene Institute established an experimental station in Block 46 under the direction of physician Erwin Ding-Schuler, tasked with developing a typhus vaccine for German troops at the front. The method consisted of deliberately infecting healthy prisoners with typhus cultures, first through cuts in the skin and later, beginning in 1943, through direct injection of contaminated blood, then testing different vaccine formulations on them to see whether they survived. Of 25 subjects in one documented group, 19 died. Polish scientist Ludwig Fleck, deported to Buchenwald and forced to work in the Block 46 laboratory, and French prisoner Alfred Balachowski, forced to cultivate strains of the very pathogen later injected into fellow prisoners, exploited Ding-Schuler's limited technical expertise to secretly sabotage part of the production. They produced deliberately weak vaccine batches that were delivered to German officers while reserving the more effective doses for prisoners in the camp. The same disease made inevitable in every camp by generalized sanitary neglect became, here, an instrument of military experimentation. And the resistance of a handful of prisoner doctors, risking their own lives inside the very block where the pathogen was being produced, ultimately saved more people than Ding-Schuler ever realized. Ding-Schuler himself never stood trial. Arrested by American troops on the 25th of April 1945, he took his own life in August of that year before proceedings could begin. His direct superior, Joachim Mistrugowski, head of the Waffen-SS Hygiene Institute and ultimately responsible for ordering the typhus experiments in Block 46, did stand in the dock at the doctor's trial held in Nuremberg between late 1946 and August 1947. 947. The tribunal found him guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced him to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on the 2nd of June 1948 at Landsberg prison. The man whose official title included the word hygiene, and who had turned that word into a synonym for lethal experimentation on bodies the system itself deliberately kept diseased, was ultimately judged precisely for the work done under that title. The irony was not lost on the prosecutors, who emphasized in their closing arguments how a man trained to prevent epidemics had devoted his career to manufacturing them within the very institutions he was supposedly meant to protect. By the summer of 1944, the concentration camp system itself had begun to exceed the limits its architects had calculated. The mass deportation of Hungarian Jews overwhelmed Auschwitz-Birkenau with transports arriving at a rate far beyond the camp's processing capacity. That saturation immediately spread to the latrines, showers, and water supply. Blocks designed for 300 people held 700 or 800. The ratio of latrine holes per prisoner, already grossly inadequate in previous years, became almost symbolic. Lines to reach the latrine during the short available break grew so long that access became a matter of probability. Many women knew in advance that they would not reach the front before the whistle called them back to work and accepted the punishment that would follow. Camp doctors themselves, overwhelmed by the volume of new transports, could no longer even apply the selective criteria that had previously governed sanitary inspections. There was no time left to distinguish one sick prisoner from another. Illness became the general condition of the inmate population rather than the exception marking a few individuals. When the Soviet advance forced the evacuation of camps in the east, beginning in January 1945, the sanitary crisis literally moved onto the roads. The death marches that drove tens of thousands of prisoners out of Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, Stutthof, and other camps included no hygienic stops. Prisoners walked for days, in temperatures several degrees below freezing. Anyone who needed to relieve themselves had to do so without stopping the column, under the eyes of guards who shot anyone who fell more than a few seconds behind. Wet clothing froze against the skin within minutes. According to numerous later testimonies, prolonged contact between frozen fabric and the legs caused frostbite and necrosis that left lifelong damage among those who survived the march. Those who stopped even briefly to relieve themselves out of the direct sight of a guard risked the column moving on without them, leaving them alone in snow and darkness. Many survivors later remembered that possibility as even more terrifying than the bullet itself. The final destination of many of those columns was Bergen-Belsen, a camp that until late 1944 had operated under conditions relatively less lethal than some others in the system, and that within weeks became the point where every sanitary failure of the concentration camp regime converged at. Once, the camp population, estimated at around 15,000 prisoners at the beginning of 1944, multiplied several times over with the constant arrival of evacuees from the east. The water, latrine, and housing infrastructure did not expand in the same proportion. Commandant Josef Kramer, who had taken charge of the camp in May 1944, wrote a letter on the 1st of March 1945 to Richard Glucks, head of the SS concentration camp administration, describing a situation he himself called catastrophic and requesting urgent assistance. Berlin's response was not to reduce the camp population. It was to keep the camp open and continue receiving Jewish evacuees from the east, worsening exactly the problem Kramer had described. The distance between what the camp commandant requested and what Berlin ordered captures better than almost any other document from the period how the system actually functioned. Even when a direct administrator acknowledged in writing that conditions had become unsustainable, the bureaucracy continued to prioritize the uninterrupted flow of deportees over any sanitary consideration. At Stutthof, near Danzig, the building intended for clothing disinfection eventually revealed how completely the line between hygiene and extermination could dissolve within the concentration camp system. The chamber, barely 5 meters long and 3 wide, had originally been built as a delousing room for textiles. It continued to be used for that purpose even after June 1944, when camp authorities began dropping the same Zyklon B pellets through a small opening in the ceiling. Now, with living prisoners locked inside instead of bundles of infested clothing, the SS non-commissioned officer supervising the gassings had been trained at Auschwitz and applied exactly the same technical procedure to human bodies that a disinfection worker applied to a striped uniform. Heat the chamber to accelerate gas release. Introduce the substance. Wait for the calculated time. Ventilate before entering. The typhus epidemic that devastated Stutthof during the winter of 1944, sustained by the same overcrowding and lack of water found throughout the camp system, gave the administration an additional justification. Prisoners too weak or sick to work, precisely those whom sanitary neglect had reduced to that condition, were the first selected to die in the very room that was supposedly meant to disinfect their clothing. Without enough running water, without electricity to pump what little remained, and without the means to disinfect clothing or barracks, the typhus epidemic already circulating among new arrivals spread without any real obstacle. The daily death toll rose from dozens to hundreds, and by March 1945 exceeded 400 deaths per day. Bodies accumulated between the barracks because there was not enough fuel even to keep the camp's single crematorium oven functioning, and it could not have processed such a volume even if it had received all the coal it needed. Among the thousands of women held under these conditions was Anne Frank, transferred to Bergen-Belsen from Auschwitz at the end of October 1944, together with her sister Margot. Both contracted typhus during that winter, already weakened by months of hunger and extreme cold, and died within weeks of each other in February or March 1945, only weeks before British troops entered the camp. On the 15th of April 1945, when the British 11th Armored Division entered Bergen-Belsen, it found approximately 60,000 people crowded together alongside thousands of unburied corpses scattered between the barracks and piled into open pits. No one was even attempting to cover. There was no running water, no electricity. Dysentery and typhus had left most survivors so severely dehydrated that many died in the days after liberation, despite finally receiving medical care, simply because their bodies could no longer tolerate water or food after months of systematic deprivation. British medical officers estimated that around 15,000 people were suffering from typhus at the time of liberation, and that virtually the entire inmate population suffered some degree of diarrhea caused by dysentery or simple starvation. Military witnesses who entered during those first days later recalled that the smell of the camp could be detected from several kilometers away, before the column even reached the main gate. A physical warning of what lay inside that no previous intelligence report had managed to convey with equal clarity. British troops forced the SS guards who remained in the camp, including Kramer himself, to load corpses onto trucks for burial in mass graves, under the eyes of survivors who had spent months watching companions die while no one lifted a finger. Weeks later, faced with the impossibility of sanitizing land so deeply contaminated by disease, the British Army chose to burn the entire barracks complex of Bergen-Belsen to the ground in an attempt to stop once and for all the spread of typhus that had made the camp the most extreme symbol of what deliberate sanitary neglect could produce when sustained without limit for years. Dachau, the oldest concentration camp in the Nazi system, opened in 1933, experienced a parallel crisis during its final weeks. Beginning in early 1945, evacuation transports from camps farther east arrived without interruption at a facility designed for only a fraction of the population it eventually held. Barracks intended for 250 people housed as many as 1,600. At no point did the administration expand the number of latrines or the water supply. Typhus, carried by lice in the clothing of new arrivals, spread with the same speed seen at Bergen-Belsen and killed as many as 400 prisoners per day in the weeks before liberation. When soldiers of the American 45th Infantry Division entered the camp on the 29th of April 1945, the first thing they encountered was not the camp itself, but a train standing on nearby tracks, 39 freight cars, more than 2,000 bodies in advanced stages of decomposition, prisoners evacuated from Buchenwald who had died of starvation, cold, or typhus during a journey lasting several days without food or water. Inside the camp, the soldiers found more than 30,000 survivors surrounded by piles of corpses. The U.S. Army kept the liberated prisoners inside the camp for additional weeks, not out of cruelty, but because the risk of the typhus epidemic spreading beyond the camp boundaries remained real even after the arrival of the liberators. In September 1945, a British military tribunal assembled in a gymnasium in Lüneburg placed Joseph Kramer and 44 other former members of the Belsen and Auschwitz staffs in the dock. The central case for the prosecution did not focus only on executions or gas chambers. It also centered on something much harder to fit into the legal categories that existed at the time: the systematic and deliberate deprivation of habitable shelter, medical care, water, and sanitation. No previous criminal code had defined this precisely because no state had previously organized deprivation on such a scale as a matter of state policy. Prosecutors had to rely on the broader categories of war crimes and crimes against humanity, because no international treaty written before 1945 had even contemplated the possibility that denying water and soap could, by itself, function as a method of extermination. A British medical officer who had visited the camp in the days after liberation testified before the tribunal that the almost complete absence of sanitary facilities was one of the features that had remained most deeply engraved in his memory, alongside the unburied corpses and the nearly skeletal bodies of survivors. The tribunal sentenced 11 defendants to death, including Kramer. The sentences were carried out at Hamelin Prison on the 13th of December 1945. For the first time, sanitary neglect ceased to be treated as a collateral effect of war and was judged for what it had always been: a deliberate instrument of extermination. Members of the tribunal, officers who had fought at the front and witnessed many forms of violence, later admitted that none of them had been prepared to process legally a crime that did not consist of one violent act, but of the sustained accumulation of thousands of minor administrative decisions, each apparently bureaucratic, which together produced a result indistinguishable from mass murder. The effects of those years of deprivation did not disappear with liberation. Medical studies conducted decades later among survivor populations documented a far higher than expected prevalence of chronic digestive disorders, including persistent forms of colitis and food intolerance, directly attributable to repeated episodes of untreated dysentery during imprisonment. Other survivors carried visible skin scars for the rest of their lives, the aftermath of scabies infections that had never received adequate treatment and left permanent marks on their arms and legs. Harder to measure, but equally documented in dozens of testimonies collected by historians and psychologists in later decades, was the persistence of shame associated with the body itself, with dirt, with a loss of control over the most basic physical functions. Many survivors described this as one of the hardest wounds to name aloud, even before their own families, in the years after the war. When someone asked about their scars, many preferred to invent almost any story rather than tell the truth, because putting the real origin of those marks into words also meant acknowledging aloud just how deeply the system had invaded and controlled the most intimate parts of their bodies. At Neuengamme, near Hamburg, sanitary deprivation took a different but equally lethal form. Prisoners assigned to widen the canal connecting the camp with the city's waterways spent the entire day standing knee-deep in freezing mud, digging sludge with shovels and wheelbarrows under constant supervision from capos armed with sticks who beat anyone who slowed down. The return to camp each afternoon included no time set aside to remove that mud from the body. The same rusted bowls used for soup were also used, without any proper washing in between, for the little improvised washing some prisoners managed. A Polish survivor imprisoned there from August 1940 later recalled that on the worst weather days, the column returning from the canal carried back 20 or 30 sick or dead companions whose bodies had succumbed not only to physical exertion, but to infections entering through every cut or abrasion, exposed to contaminated mud. The water that should have cleaned had become, in Neuengamme, as in every other camp in the system, the very medium through which disease entered the body rather than leaving it. At Ebensee, a Mauthausen subcamp built in the Austrian Alps to excavate tunnels for weapons storage, barrack mattresses were filled with sawdust. That same sawdust, mixed with sweat and filth from the bodies sleeping on it, became a permanent breeding ground for lice infesting the camp from end to end. Prisoners working 11-hour shifts inside the tunnels returned covered in the same rock dust they had breathed throughout the day, with nowhere to shake it off before lying down on mattresses already infested with parasites. Each night of supposed rest became, in practice, a new exposure to the same infestation the workday had already begun incubating in their lungs and on their skin. The cycle repeated without interruption. Mine dust dirtied the body, the infested mattress sickened it during the night, and the total absence of water to clean either one guaranteed that the next cycle would begin at exactly the same point of deterioration as the one before it. At Majdanek, on the outskirts of Lublin, the camp was built and expanded improvisationally throughout its existence, and that permanent provisionality was reflected directly in sanitation. During its entire first year of operation, none of the prisoner blocks had any proper sanitary installation. Bodily needs had to be handled inside the barracks, using buckets or wooden boxes that were not emptied regularly. During the day, prisoners used pits dug directly into the earth, sometimes reinforced by only a crude wooden frame, located in the center of each camp section near the kitchens. Only in late summer 1943, after prisoners had already been dying by the thousands from typhus for months, were the barracks finally connected to a sewage system and actual toilets installed. One prisoner who had previously been transferred from Dachau later described Majdanek by comparison as making the earlier camp seem almost like a rest home. At Gross Rosen, built beside a granite quarry operated by a company owned by the SS itself, the calculated life expectancy of a prisoner assigned to stonework barely reached 5 weeks. On the 30th of June 1941, less than a year after the camp opened, a typhus epidemic broke out. Camp administrators themselves later attributed it in internal reports to exactly the same causes repeated throughout the system: lack of hygiene and inadequate sanitary conditions in the barracks. The administrative response was no different from that of other camps. Quarantine to prevent infection spreading to the German garrison, no meaningful investment in running water or additional latrines, and a quarry that continued demanding the same daily output of granite from men whose life expectancy had already been measured in weeks before disease even entered the equation. At Flossenburg, another camp built beside a granite deposit, dysentery completely paralyzed camp operations throughout January 1940, barely 2 years after its opening. The administration itself documented the episode without adopting any structural sanitary measure to prevent recurrence. Typhus returned forcefully in September 1944 and again in January 1945. Both outbreaks coincided with waves of evacuation, transports from other camps, arriving already infested with lice, and the camp infirmary, chronically deprived of resources, had no means to isolate or treat them. The sequence had become as predictable as it was mechanical. Every time the concentration camp system had to absorb a new wave of prisoners displaced from another part of the front, disease traveled with them and found, at every destination, exactly the same overcrowding and scarcity it needed to spread without obstruction. At Ravensbrück, the only camp in the system built specifically for women, Siemens established a production plant beside the camp beginning in 1942 and transferred between 2,000 and 3,000 prisoners to nearby barracks to manufacture coils, switches, and electrical components during 12-hour shifts. The proximity between housing and factory reduced travel time, but it was not accompanied by any equivalent sanitary improvement. The same women who spent all day seated at precision machinery, requiring extreme cleanliness in the components they handled, returned at night to barracks, without enough running water even to wash industrial grease and solvents from their hands. Factory management regularly complained to camp administrators about the high illness rate among assigned workers and demanded constant replacements. Those complaints never resulted in improvements to the sanitary conditions causing the illness. Training a new prisoner to operate machinery required weeks. Allowing one to die of dysentery or typhus, by contrast, imposed no additional cost on an administration, with a constant stream of new deportees available to replace her. Each of the 12 barracks originally intended to house prisoners at Ravensbrück had, according to the camp's original design, a single washroom and a single row of toilets for all women assigned to that block. That arrangement, already insufficient from the first day, deteriorated even further beginning in 1943, when mass arrivals multiplied the population of each barrack without a single additional installation being built. Women trained as camp guards, by contrast, lived in separate facilities and had access to water unlike anything ordinary prisoners ever experienced. At Sachsenhausen, Germany's military footwear industry, searching for substitutes for leather increasingly rationed by the war, turned prisoners' feet into laboratory material. On a 700-meter track built near the Appellplatz, containing 9 different surfaces of asphalt, concrete, gravel, cinders, and sand kept permanently waterlogged, a detail known as the Schuhläuferkommando marched between 25 and 40 kilometers every day, wearing new boots that sole manufacturers needed tested before supplying them to the German army. Beginning in 1944, the test was deliberately intensified. Prisoners had to march in footwear 1 or 2 sizes too small, carrying 20-kilogram sacks of sand on their backs, during shifts continuing day and night without real rest. No one removed the boots at the end of the day to inspect the condition of their feet. Blisters opened. They became infected through constant friction and the mud of the waterlogged track. No prisoner had bandages, spare socks, or even a single minute to wash their feet before putting the same boots back on the next day. It is estimated that 20 men died every day on that track, not from a bullet and not directly from hunger, but because infection from a destroyed foot, with no possibility of treatment, eventually spread through the entire body. For children who survived without families, reconstruction also began with the body before anything else. In a former Bavarian monastery converted into a reception center by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, more than 100 children from 13 different countries, many of them Jewish survivors of the camps, received during 1945 something no Nazi regulation had ever intended for them to possess: shoes in their own size, clean clothing that had not been patched with someone else's rags, their own razor, for those old enough to need one, a toothbrush they did not have to share with anyone. Organization staff described these minimal objects in internal reports as the small things that allow a person to rebuild a sense of dignity and order, precisely the same things whose systematic absence had defined those children's lives for months or years. Giving a child a toothbrush did not resolve the trauma carried inside, but in very concrete terms, it represented the first administrative gesture in that child's recent life that was not designed to destroy them. Some of those same children, decades later as adults, remembered that toothbrush in greater detail than they remembered their actual liberation, because it was that tiny object, not the arrival of soldiers, that first made them feel someone was treating them again as people rather than as a logistical problem to be managed. Even liberation did not immediately end the assault of lice and typhus on survivors' bodies. Allied armies entering the camps had to improvise. Within days, the sanitary infrastructure the Nazi administration had never built in years. American and British soldiers moved along lines of survivors, carrying compressed air sprayers loaded with 10% DDT powder, inserting the nozzle beneath underwear, down shirt collars, and into sleeves to coat every centimeter of skin where lice might still be hiding. At Bergen-Belsen, around 29,000 survivors had to be moved into an emergency hospital established in former German military facilities during the first month after liberation. 14,000 of them died despite those efforts, their bodies already too damaged by years of deprivation to respond to treatment. Displaced persons camps later established by the Allies in Germany, Austria, and Italy for people with nowhere to return continued for months to depend on the same logic of quarantine, delousing, and epidemic control that had marked their entire existence within the concentration camp system. But with one decisive difference. Now that control was intended to save their lives rather than take them. For many survivors, that first blast of white powder under their clothes marked, more than any speech or flag, the exact physical moment when the war had ended for them. On the 27th of January 1945, 4 days before her 11th birthday, Eva Moses Kor watched Soviet troops enter through the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Of the approximately 1,500 pairs of twins used by Josef Mengele in his experiments, barely 200 children were still alive that day, among them Eva and her sister Miriam. Months earlier, the same girl who had learned on the Appellplatz to calculate how long she could control her own body before the system betrayed her, had also survived an extremely high fever caused by one of Mengele's injections. Alone, she dragged herself across the floor of an infirmary without electricity and almost without staff toward the only water tap she could make out in the darkness, convinced that if she died, her twin sister would immediately be killed so German doctors could compare the results of both autopsies. She reached the tap. She drank. She survived. Decades later, after settling in Indiana, Eva Kor returned every year to walk among the same barracks of Birkenau at the head of groups of students, pointing to the exact place where that latrine had once stood. That water tap. That yard where the body of a 10-year-old girl had learned before anything else that survival began by controlling every involuntary movement of her own flesh. During those visits, before speaking to the students following her, Eva Kor would always stop for a moment in front of the same patch of ground where the latrine had once stood. She would say nothing, as though she needed to feel with her own feet that the ground was still there, that the camp no longer had any power over her body, and that the only calculation left for her to make was how many more years she would be able to keep telling this story before no one remained who could tell it from the inside.